They called him the Beast of the Bighorns, a man who spoke to wolves more than he spoke to people. Victoria Miller was just a widow who had lost everything: her husband, her money, and her pride. When the blizzard hit and her wagon shattered against the ice, she thought death had finally come to collect her. Instead, a shadow loomed over her. Silas Blackwood didn't offer a hand. He didn't offer comfort. He looked at her with eyes cold as the snow and said the words that would change her life forever. "You're going to bed with me tonight." She thought he was a monster. She was wrong. He was something much more dangerous. The Wyoming wind didn't just blow. It bit. It chewed through the thin wood of the cabin walls and gnawed at the bones of anyone foolish enough to live on the edge of the territory. Victoria Miller stood by the frosted window pane, clutching a shawl that had been threadbare 3 winters ago. She watched the rider approach. Even through the distortion of the cheap glass and the swirling snow, she knew who it was. The horse was a towering black gelding, too well fed for this part of the country, and the man atop it wore a coat trimmed in beaver fur that cost more than Victoria's entire life. It was Jedediah Cross. Her stomach turned over, a cold knot of dread that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature. Jedediah was the owner of the Laramie Mercantile and Trust, and effectively, the owner of half the valley. More importantly, he was the man holding the note on the Miller homestead. Victoria checked the mantelpiece. The revolver there. A heavy, rusting Colt Navy that had belonged to her late husband, Thomas, was loaded, but she prayed she wouldn't have to touch it. Her hands were shaking too badly to aim. The door burst open without a knock. The wind howled into the room, scattering the few embers left in the hearth before Jedediah slammed it shut. He didn't stomp the snow off his... He just walked onto the clean floorboards Victoria had scrubbed that morning, leaving wet, muddy tracks. "Afternoon, Widow Miller," he said, his voice smooth and oily, like grease in a skillet. He took off his hat, revealing slicked-back hair that smelled of lavender water, a scent so out of place in the rugged cabin it made Victoria want to gag. "Mr. Cross," Victoria said, keeping her back to the fire, trying to shield the meager warmth from him, though the fire was dying anyway. "You're early." "The note isn't due until the 1st of the month," Jedediah smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. His eyes were small, dark beads that scanned the room, cataloging the poverty. They lingered on the empty larder, the single broken chair, and finally on Victoria herself. She pulled the shawl tighter. "Business is unpredictable, Victoria." "Can I call you Victoria?" "I feel we've known each other long enough." He didn't wait for permission. "The bank in Cheyenne is calling in some of my liquidity. I need to settle my accounts. I'm afraid I need the payment today. $500. $500? Victoria gasped. The remaining debt was $300, and Thomas paid $50 before the accident. Interest, my dear. Penalties. Lawyer's fees regarding the deed transfer. Jedediah waved a gloved hand dismissively. It adds up. But let's be honest. You don't have $500. You don't have $5. Victoria lifted her chin. I have the cattle. I can sell the herd in the spring. The herd? Jedediah let out a sharp, barking laugh. You mean those 12 scrawny heifers freezing in the pasture? They won't survive the winter, and neither will you. He took a step closer. The smell of lavender and stale tobacco was overpowering. Look at you. You're thinning away. Thomas, God rest his soul, was a fool to bring a delicate flower like you out here. But I'm a charitable man. I have a proposition. Victoria stepped back, her hand drifting toward the mantelpiece. I'm not interested in your charity, Mr. Cross. It's not charity. It's a trade. He looked her up and down, his gaze possessive. Marry me. You'll have the finest house in Laramie, servants to cook your meals, silks from St. Louis. And this debt? Wiped clean. I would rather freeze, Victoria said, her voice trembling with rage. You hounded Thomas. You cheated him on the seed prices. You're the reason he was working himself to death in that mine when the collapse happened. Jedediah's face hardened. The mask of politeness slipped. Thomas was a drunk and a gambler. He died because he was careless. And now you're alone. You have until sundown tomorrow, Victoria. Pay the $500, or I take the land. And if I take the land, the sheriff will escort you to the edge of town. You know what happens to women without protection out here? He put his hat back on. Think about it. A warm bed with me, or a cold grave out here. He turned and left. As the door slammed, the Colt Navy revolver rattled on the mantelpiece. Victoria grabbed it, her knuckles white. She wanted to run outside and shoot him in the back. But she knew it was useless. Jedediah owned the sheriff, the judge, and the town. She sank into the rocking chair, the gun heavy in her lap. Sundown tomorrow. She had no money. She had no family. But she remembered something Thomas had said in a fever dream right before he died. He had mumbled about a cabin in the high peaks near the Devil's Tower Pass. He said he'd left something there with a man he trusted, a man named Silas. Most people in town spoke the name Silas Blackwood in whispers. They said he was a mountain man who had turned his back on civilization after the war. They said he killed a bear with a knife. They said he shot trespassers on sight. But if Thomas had trusted him, maybe, just maybe, he would help. It was a 3-hour ride up the mountain. A blizzard was coming. It was suicide. Victoria stood up. She looked at the muddy footprints Jedediah had left. Better to die in the snow trying to fight, she thought, than to sleep in that man's bed. She packed her saddlebags with the last of the dried venison, wrapped herself in every blanket she owned, and walked out to the barn to saddle her mare, Bessie. "Come on, girl," she whispered into the horse's ear. "We're going to find the beast." The ascent was brutal. The air grew thinner and colder with every mile. By the time Victoria reached the timberline, the snowflakes were no longer drifting. They were being driven sideways like tiny needles. Bessie was struggling. The snow was up to the horse's knees, and the wind was howling so loud Victoria couldn't hear her own thoughts. The trail Thomas had described in his journals was barely visible, a faint scar on the side of the mountain that disappeared into the whiteout conditions. "Just a little further," Victoria shouted, though the wind snatched the words away instantly. She was losing feeling in her fingers. Her toes had gone numb an hour ago. She knew the signs of hypothermia, the drowsiness, the confusion. She had to keep moving. Suddenly, Bessie reared. A crack like thunder echoed through the valley. Not lightning, but the sound of a massive pine tree snapping under the weight of the snow and wind. It crashed onto the path ahead of them. Bessie panicked. The mare slipped on the ice, her legs flailing. Victoria was thrown from the saddle. She hit the ground hard, her shoulder slamming against a rock buried in the snow. Pain exploded down her arm, hot and blinding. She tumbled down the slope, sliding uncontrollably until she crashed into a snowbank. When she finally came to a stop, the world was spinning. "Bessie!" she screamed. But the horse was gone, spooked and running back down the trail, taking the saddlebags. And the food with her. Victoria tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. The cold was seeping into her marrow now. She was alone, injured, at 8,000 feet in the middle of a blizzard. She crawled. She didn't know where she was going, but she crawled toward the shelter of the trees. Her vision began to blur. The white snow turned to gray. She curled into a ball, the darkness closing in. So this is it, she thought. Jedediah wins. She closed her eyes. She didn't know how much time passed. Maybe minutes, maybe hours. She was awoken by the crunch of heavy boots on snow. It wasn't a hallucination. The ground vibrated with each step. She forced her eyes open, her lashes frozen together. A figure towered over her. He was massive, a giant of a man wrapped in buffalo skins and leather. His face was obscured by a thick, dark beard encrusted with ice and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. He held a rifle in one hand as easily as if it were a twig. He didn't say a word. He just stared down at her. "Help." Victoria croaked, her voice barely a whisper. The man grunted. He slung the rifle over his shoulder and bent down. He didn't ask if she was hurt. He scooped her up into his arms like she weighed nothing. Victoria was too weak to protest. She pressed her face against the rough fur of his coat. He smelled of pine and wood smoke and something coppery, like fresh blood. He carried her through the storm, his stride steady and unyielding against the wind. Victoria drifted in and out of consciousness. She saw flashes of a cabin, rough-hewn logs, a heavy wooden door, the glow of a lantern. Then, warmth. She was dropped, not gently, onto a pile of furs. The sudden heat of the room was a shock to her frozen skin. She gasped, her body seizing with uncontrollable shivers. She looked up. The man was barring the door against the storm. He turned to face her. In the firelight, he was terrifying. A scar ran from his temple down to his jaw, cutting through the beard. His eyes were a piercing, unnatural blue, burning with an intensity that made Victoria shrink back. This was Silas Blackwood. He stripped off his heavy coat and hung it on a peg. He walked over to the fire and threw a log on, sending sparks flying. Then he turned his gaze on her. Victoria tried to sit up, clutching her frozen shoulder. Thank you. I came to find you. Thomas Miller, my husband. Thomas is dead, Silas said. His voice was a deep rumble, vibrating in his chest. It wasn't sympathetic. It was a statement of fact. Yes, he. And you're a fool for coming up here in this weather. Silas cut her off. He walked over to her, looming large. You're freezing. Your lips are blue. Your clothes are wet. Victoria shivered violently. I lost my horse. Silas stared at her for a long moment. He looked at her shivering form, her wet dress clinging to her skin, the ice in her hair. He looked at the single narrow bunk in the corner of the room, the only bed in the cabin. It was piled high with blankets, the warmest place in the drafty structure. He looked back at her, his expression unreadable, hard as granite. He took a step toward her. Get up, he commanded. Victoria struggled to her feet, swaying. I need to talk to you about Thomas, he said. Silas ignored her. He grabbed a heavy wool blanket from a chair and tossed it at her feet. Then he began to unbutton his flannel shirt. Victoria's eyes went wide. What are you doing? Silas paused, his hand on the last button, exposing a chest crisscrossed with old scars. He looked her dead in the eye, his face devoid of any softness. You're hypothermic. The fire isn't enough. You need body heat, or your heart will stop before morning. He gestured to the narrow bunk in the corner. You're going to bed with me tonight. Victoria froze, her breath catching in her throat. The isolation, the rumors of the beast, the sheer size of him. Panic flared in her chest. She backed away until she hit the rough log wall. No, she whispered. I won't. Silas didn't blink. It wasn't a request, widow. You can sleep in that bed with me and live, or you can sleep on the floor and die. Make your choice. Victoria stared at the man, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The wind outside shrieked, battering the cabin walls, a reminder that the world outside was dead and frozen. Inside, the fire popped, casting long, dancing shadows across Silas Blackwood's scarred face. He didn't move. He stood by the bunk, his shirt open, waiting. He wasn't leering. He wasn't smiling. He looked at her with the same detached practicality a man might use when looking at a broken fence post that needed mending. I won't ask again, Silas rumbled. Frost is already in your blood, Victoria. You're shaking so hard you're about to crack your teeth. Swallow your pride or swallow the snow. Victoria looked at her hands. They were pale, waxy, and clumsy. She tried to make a fist and couldn't. The cold wasn't just on her skin. It was inside her, a slow poison shutting down her organs one by one. She thought of Jedediah Cross. If she died here, tonight, Jedediah would win. He would take the farm. He would laugh over her grave. Rage flared in her chest, a tiny spark of heat. I will not let him win. Turn around, she whispered, her voice trembling. Silas didn't argue. He turned his back to her, facing the wall. With fumbling, numb fingers, Victoria peeled off her sodden dress. The wet wool was heavy, clinging to her like a second skin. When the air hit her bare shoulders, she gasped, the cold biting deep. She stripped down to her thin cotton chemise and pantalettes, shivering so violently she could barely stand. She moved toward the bunk. I'm ready. Silas blew out the lantern, plunging the room into semi-darkness, lit only by the dying embers of the hearth. He sat on the edge of the bed and pulled off his boots. The mattress, stuffed with straw and pine needles, creaked under his massive weight. He lay down against the far wall and held up the heavy bear fur quilt. Get in! Victoria hesitated for one heartbeat, then climbed in. The bed was narrow. There was no way to avoid touching him. As she slid under the furs, her icy arm brushed against his chest. He hissed at the contact. She must have felt like a corpse against his skin. Closer, he ordered. There's no point in lying on the edge. He didn't wait for her to comply. His arm, thick with muscle and scarred from a life of violence, hooked around her waist. He pulled her flush against him. Victoria stiffened, a gasp trapped in her throat. She expected him to be rough. She expected him to try something. But he simply held her there, his body acting as a massive radiator. He was burning hot, radiating a dry, intense heat that seemed to seep straight through her frozen clothes. "Relax," he grumbled near her ear. His voice was deep, a vibration she felt in her spine. "I ain't gonna hurt you. I'm just keeping you alive." Victoria lay rigid for a long time, staring into the dark. She could smell him. Wood smoke, leather, and soap. He didn't smell like the unwashed drunkards at the saloon. He smelled clean. Slowly, the pain of the thawing began. Her fingers and toes throbbed as the blood returned. The uncontrollable shivering began to subside, replaced by a heavy, drowsy warmth. Her head was resting on his shoulder. It was hard as rock, but strangely comfortable. "Why?" she whispered into the darkness. "Why what?" "Why did Thomas send me to you? He said he trusted you, but the town says you're a monster." Silas was silent for a long time. She thought he had fallen asleep. "Town folk talk because they're bored," he said finally. "And Thomas knew the difference between a monster and a man who just wants to be left alone. We rode together, years back, before the mines, before he met you. He never told me." Thomas had a lot of secrets, Victoria. Some to keep you safe, some to keep himself sane. Silas shifted, pulling the blanket higher around her shoulders. "Go to sleep. We talk in the morning. If the storm breaks." Victoria wanted to ask more, but the warmth was narcotic. For the first time since Thomas died, she felt safe, not just warm, but protected. The arm draped over her wasn't a cage. It was a shield. Her eyes drifted shut. The last thing she felt was Silas's rough hand brushing a stray lock of damp hair away from her forehead, a gesture so tender it shocked her more than his gun would have. Underscore, 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 underscore. The morning light was blinding. Victoria woke with a start. The space beside her was empty. The furs had been tucked tightly around her to keep the heat in. She sat up, clutching the blanket to her chest. The cabin was bright, sunlight streaming through the small window. The storm was over. Silas was standing by the wood stove, frying bacon in a cast-iron skillet. He was fully dressed, wearing a fresh flannel shirt. He looked over his shoulder as she stirred. "Coffee's hot," he said, gesturing to a tin cup on the table. Victoria scrambled out of bed, grabbing her dress from where it had been hung near the fire to dry. She dressed quickly behind the privacy of the open cupboard door, her face burning with the memory of the night before. She had slept in his arms. She had practically curled into him. When she emerged, fully dressed and hair hastily braided, Silas slid a plate of bacon and cornbread toward her. "Eat," he said. "You'll need the strength. It's a hard ride back down." Victoria took a bite of the cornbread. It was surprisingly good. "Thank you. For everything. For saving me." Silas leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. The scar on his face looked less terrifying in the daylight, more like a badge of survival. "Don't thank me yet. You came up here for a reason, and it wasn't just a social call. You sent you." Victoria set the fork down. The reality of her situation came crashing back. Jedediah Cross. The name seemed to suck the air out of the room. Silas's eyes narrowed. "What about him?" "He holds the note on our land. He says I owe $500. I have until sundown today." Victoria's voice broke. He told me if I didn't pay, I could marry him, or he'd throw me out for the wolves." Silas didn't move, but the air around him seemed to crackle. His knuckles turned white where he gripped his own arm. "He killed Thomas. It wasn't a question." Victoria looked up, startled. "What?" "No, Thomas died in the mine collapse. It was an accident. There are no accidents when Jedediah Cross is involved," Silas growled. He pushed off the counter and walked to the far corner of the cabin. There was a loose floorboard under the window. He pried it up with the heel of his boot and reached into the darkness beneath. He pulled out a metal lockbox. It was battered and rusted, covered in dust. "Thomas knew he was in danger," Silas said, placing the box on the table between them. "He came to me 3 months ago. He left this. He said, if anything happens to me and Victoria comes to find you, give her this. If she doesn't come, burn it. Victoria stared at the box. "What is it?" "Evidence," Silas said. He pulled a key from a leather string around his neck. "And the reason Jedediah wants your land so badly, it ain't about the cows, Victoria, and it ain't about you." He turned the key. The lock clicked. The lid of the box creaked open. Inside, there was no gold, no jewelry, just a stack of papers wrapped in oilcloth and a small leather-bound journal. Victoria reached out, her hand trembling, and picked up the journal. Thomas's handwriting. She recognized the chaotic scrawl immediately. "Read the last entry," Silas commanded gently. Victoria flipped to the end. The date was 2 days before the mine collapse. "I found it. God help me. I found it. The vein doesn't run north like Cross says. It dives deep, right under my south pasture." The surveys Cross showed the town were faked. "He's been buying up the valley to get to the main lode, but the heart of it is under my house. He knows I know. I saw him talking to the foreman today. They were looking at the support beams in Sector 4. I have to hide the deed to the mineral rights. I'm taking it to Silas. If I die, Cross killed me for the gold." Victoria dropped the journal. She felt sick. "He murdered him," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "He murdered my husband for gold. And now he wants to marry you," Silas said, his voice cold as steel. "Not because he loves you, but because if he marries you, the property becomes his by law. He doesn't need to buy it. He doesn't need to fight for it. He just needs you to say, 'I do,' and he owns the biggest gold vein in Wyoming." Silas reached into the box and pulled out a thick parchment with an official government seal. "This is the original mineral rights deed. Thomas registered it in Cheyenne under a holding company name so Cross wouldn't see it in the local records. As long as you hold this, Cross can't touch a speck of dirt on your land." Victoria wiped her tears. The sadness was evaporating, replaced by a white-hot fury. All the months of hunger, the cold nights, the humiliation of Jedediah standing in her cabin, looking at her like she was a piece of meat on sale. It was all a lie. "He thinks I'm weak," Victoria said, her voice hardening. "He thinks I'm just a helpless widow." "Are you?" Silas asked. He was watching her closely, testing her. Victoria stood up. She picked up the heavy Colt Navy revolver she had brought with her, the one she hadn't known how to use. She slammed it onto the table next to the deed. "No," she said. "I'm not." Silas smiled. It was a terrifying, feral smile. "Good." He walked over to the gun rack on the wall and pulled down a Winchester repeater and a belt of ammunition. "The sun is high. We have 6 hours to get back to town before the deadline. If we miss it, the sheriff will sign the eviction order, and this deed won't matter until we drag it through courts for years, which you can't afford." "We can't make it in 6 hours," Victoria said, looking at the snow outside. "The trail is blocked." "We aren't taking the trail," Silas said. He tossed her a heavy coat, one of his spare ones. "We're taking the ridge line. It's steep, it's dangerous, and if the horses slip, we die. But it'll get us there in 4. He grabbed the lockbox and shoved it into his saddlebag. "Do you trust me, Victoria?" Victoria looked at the man she had feared yesterday. The beast. The monster. She saw the scars. Yes, but she also saw the man who had warmed her when she was freezing. The man who had kept her husband's secret safe. "Yes," she said. "Then let's go hunt a banker. Underscore, 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 underscore." The ride down the ridge was a nightmare. The wind had died down, but the path was little more than a goat track clinging to the side of a cliff. On one side, a sheer wall of rock. On the other, a 1,000-foot drop into the valley below. Silas rode in front, his black stallion sure-footed and calm. Victoria rode behind him on Bessie, who had miraculously found her way back to the cabin during the night, shivering and hungry, but alive. They didn't speak. They couldn't. All their focus was on keeping the horses moving. Halfway down, Silas held up a hand. He halted his horse. "What is it?" Victoria asked, her voice tight. Silas pointed down toward the tree line, about a mile below them. "Look!" Victoria squinted against the glare of the sun on the snow. There, in the clearing where the main trail widened, sat 3 men on horseback. They were waiting. "Cross's men," Silas said. "He figured you might try to run, or that you might survive the storm. He sent a welcoming party to make sure you never make it back to town to pay that debt." "They have rifles," Victoria said, seeing the glint of steel. They do, Silas nodded. He pulled his Winchester from its scabbard. He looked at Victoria. Can you shoot that pistol of yours? I can point and pull the trigger. That ain't shooting, Silas muttered. Listen to me. We have to ride through them. We can't go around. We don't have time. I'll draw their fire. You keep your head down and ride for the bridge. Do not stop. Do not look back. If I fall, you keep riding. I'm not leaving you, Victoria said fiercely. Silas turned in his saddle. His blue eyes locked onto hers. You aren't leaving me. You're finishing the job. You carry the deed. You are the only thing that matters right now. If they get that paper, Thomas died for nothing. He cocked the rifle. When I yell, you kick Bessie as hard as you can. Silas took a deep breath. The mountain air was crisp and cold. He looked like a king of the high country, wild and untamed. YH! He screamed, kicking his stallion into a gallop. The horse plunged down the slope, kicking up a spray of snow. Victoria hesitated only a fraction of a second before jamming her heels into Bessie's sides. The ambush began. Below them, the three men scrambled. They hadn't expected a charge from the high ridge. Gunshots cracked through the valley, echoing like thunder. Ping! A bullet struck a rock near Victoria's head, spraying stone chips. Silas didn't slow down. He rode with the reins in his teeth, firing the Winchester with one hand, levering it with a speed that blurred the eye. Bang! One of the men below flew backward off his saddle. Keep moving! Silas roared over the wind. They hit the flat ground of the clearing. The remaining two hired guns spurred their horses to intercept. One of them, a man with a red scarf, leveled his shotgun at Victoria. Silas saw it. He wrenched his stallion sideways, putting himself directly in the line of fire. The shotgun boomed. Silas jerked in his saddle. Blood sprayed from his left shoulder, staining his beaver fur coat instantly. Silas! Victoria screamed. Go! He bellowed, his voice ragged. He swung his rifle around, using the barrel like a club to smash the red-scarfed man in the face as they thundered past. The way to the bridge was open. Victoria galloped through, her heart tearing in two. She looked back. Silas was still in the saddle, but he was slumping, his left arm useless. The last gunman was turning to chase them. They had 10 miles to town, and Silas was bleeding out. The wind whipped Victoria's hair across her face, stinging her eyes, but she didn't blink. She couldn't afford to. The world had narrowed down to two things: the rhythmic pounding of Bessie's hooves against the frozen earth, and the terrifying sight of Silas Blackwood swaying in his saddle 10 yards ahead. The black stallion, sensing its master's weakness, had set its gallop to a rough canter. Blood was dripping from Silas's left sleeve, leaving a trail of bright red flecks on the pristine white snow. Silas! Victoria screamed, kicking her mare to pull alongside him. He turned his head slowly. His face, usually tanned and weathered, was gray. His lips were almost white. The shotgun blast had taken a chunk out of his shoulder, and the coat that had kept her warm the night before was now sodden with his lifeblood. Don't! Stop! Silas gritted out, his voice a wet rasp. Keep riding! You're falling off! Victoria shouted. She reached out and grabbed his reins, pulling both horses to a halt near a cluster of aspen trees. No time, Silas growled, trying to pull away, but his grip was weak. He slumped forward, clutching the saddle horn. Victoria vaulted off Bessie. She didn't feel the cold anymore. The adrenaline in her veins was like fire. She ran to Silas and grabbed his good arm, helping him slide down from the massive horse. He hit the ground heavy, his legs buckling. She dragged him to the base of a tree, propping him up. Up close, the damage was worse than she thought. The buckshot had torn through the heavy muscle of his shoulder. It wasn't a fatal shot, not instantly, but the blood loss was rapid. You stubborn fool, Victoria cried, tearing the hem of her petticoat. Why did you ride into the shot? Silas looked up at her, his blue eyes hazy but still burning with that intense, predatory light. He was aiming for you. Victoria's hands shook as she packed the fabric into the wound. Silas groaned, a low, animal sound of pain, his head tipping back against the bark. I need to bind this tight, Victoria said, her voice trembling. It's going to hurt. Do it, he breathed. She pulled the makeshift bandage as hard as she could. Silas's jaw clenched so tight she thought his teeth might shatter, but he didn't scream. He simply endured it, breathing through his nose in sharp, ragged gasps. When it was done, Victoria sat back on her heels, her hands stained with his blood. She looked at this man, this beast who was supposed to be a monster. He had given her his bed. He had given her his food. And now he had taken a bullet meant for her. She reached out, cupping his rough, bearded cheek with her blood-stained hand. "Why?" she whispered. "It's just land. It's just money." Silas opened his eyes. He reached up with his good hand, covering hers. His hand was large, swallowing hers completely. "It ain't about the land, Victoria," he murmured, his voice gaining a fraction of strength. "Thomas, he didn't just save me from a cave-in years ago. He gave me a reason to come back to the world. He told me about you. Every night by the fire, he talked about you, your strength, your kindness. He made me promise, if the wolves came, I wouldn't let him take you." Tears spilled down Victoria's cheeks, freezing in the cold air. "You kept your promise." "Not yet," Silas growled. He struggled to sit up, pushing against the tree. "Help me up. We have to move." "You can't ride," Victoria argued, trying to push him back. "I can ride," he snapped, the old steel returning to his voice. "Tie my hand to the saddle horn if you have to. But I am not dying in the snow while that snake steals your life. I am going to walk into that town, Victoria, and I am going to watch you bury him." Victoria looked at him. She saw the resolve in his eyes, a will that was stronger than iron. She nodded. She helped him stand. It took both of them, stumbling in the snow, to get him back onto the stallion. She used a length of rope to secure his left wrist to the saddle, just as he asked, so he wouldn't fall if he passed out. "Listen to me," Silas said, looking down at her as she mounted Bessie. "When we get there, don't look at the sheriff. Don't look at the Cross. You look at Cross. You look him in the eye and you don't blink. You own the room, Victoria. I'm just the muscle. You are the queen of the valley today." Victoria wiped her face, smearing the blood on her cheek like war paint. She felt a shift inside her. The fear was gone. The grief was gone. All that was left was cold, hard purpose. "Let's go," she said. They spurred the horses. Behind them, far up the ridge, the lone surviving gunman watched them go, then turned his horse around. He wasn't paid enough to fight a man who wouldn't die. Laramie was busy. It was Saturday, and the town square was filled with ranchers, miners, and townsfolk going about their trade. The clock on the church tower showed 10 minutes to 4. Sundown was at 4:30. Inside the Golden Steer Saloon, the mood was festive, though the occasion was grim. Jedediah Cross stood at the center of the room, near the bar. He had bought a round of drinks for everyone. He was wearing his finest suit, a silk vest, and a diamond stick pin in his cravat. Sheriff Brody sat at a table nearby, nursing a whiskey. Judge Holloway was there too, looking bored, a stack of legal papers in front of him. "A toast!" Jedediah shouted, raising his glass. The room quieted. "To prosperity and to the expansion of the Laramie Mercantile and Trust. Today, we acquire the Miller property. It's a tragedy, truly. That poor widow couldn't manage the affairs of her late husband. But business is the engine of civilization. Here, here!" a few sycophants shouted. "Has the widow arrived?" Judge Holloway asked, checking his pocket watch. "She won't be coming," Jedediah said with a smirk. He set his glass down. "I expect she's halfway to Nebraska by now, running from her debts. Or perhaps she lost her way in the storm. Either way, at sundown, I sign the deed in default." He looked around the room, his eyes gleaming with greed. He had won. The gold vein was his. Suddenly, the saloon doors swung open. The sound wasn't the usual creak of hinges. It was a violent crash, as if they had been kicked by a mule. The room went silent. All heads turned. Standing in the doorway was Victoria Miller. She looked like a revenant. Her hair was wild, windblown, and tangled. Her dress was torn at the hem, and on her cheek, stark against her pale skin, was a smear of dried blood. But it was her eyes that terrified them. They were cold, hard, and absolutely fearless. Behind her, filling the doorway with his massive frame, was Silas Blackwood. A collective gasp went through the saloon. The beast. Silas looked like he had walked out of hell. His coat was soaked in blood. His face was pale as death, but he stood upright, his good hand resting casually on the pearl handle of the Colt on his hip. He looked at the room with a sneer of contempt. Victoria stepped forward. Her boot heels clicked loudly on the floorboards as she walked toward the bar. The crowd parted for her like the Red Sea. No one dared to breathe. "Mrs. Miller," Jedediah said. His smile faltered, his eyes darting to Silas, then back to her. We didn't expect you." "I know," Victoria said. Her voice was calm, carrying to every corner of the room. "You expected me to be dead, or at least broken." She stopped 3 feet from him. She smelled the lavender water on him, and it made her stomach turn with hate. "I'm here to settle my husband's account," Victoria said. Jedediah laughed, a nervous sound. "Now, Victoria, be reasonable. The debt is $500. You don't have $500. He looked at the crowd, trying to regain control. She's distraught. The grief, slang. Victoria slammed the heavy gold bag, filled with rocks she had gathered by the river just for the sound, onto the bar. It wasn't money, but it sounded like it. "I'm not here to pay with cash, Mr. Cross," she said. "I'm here to pay with facts." She reached into her bodice and pulled out the oilcloth-wrapped papers. She slammed them down on the table in front of Judge Holloway. "Judge," she said, "I'd like you to examine the mineral rights deed for the Miller homestead, registered in Cheyenne 3 months ago." The room erupted in murmurs. "Mineral rights? Gold?" Jedediah's face went white. That's a forgery," he shouted, losing his composure. "She's lying! Sheriff, arrest this woman for fraud!" Silas stepped forward. He didn't draw his gun. He just took one heavy step, and the floorboards groaned. "Sit down, Jedediah," Silas rumbled. His voice was low, but it cut through the noise like a knife. Sheriff Brody looked at Silas, then at Jedediah. He stayed in his seat. He knew Silas Blackwood's reputation. He knew that even wounded, the mountain man could kill 3 men before he hit the floor. Judge Holloway adjusted his spectacles. He opened the document. He read it in silence for a long moment. Then he looked up at Jedediah. "This is authentic," the judge said. "It was the territorial seal. It seems Thomas Miller registered a claim for a Sector 4 lode beneath his pasture." The judge looked at Victoria. "Mrs. Miller, according to this, your property isn't worth $300. It's worth, well, conservatively, $50,000. The saloon exploded with noise. $50,000! It was a fortune! Victoria didn't look at the crowd. She kept her eyes locked on Jedediah. "So," she said, her voice dripping with ice. You knew about the gold. That's why you squeezed us. That's why you threatened me." I was merely acting as a businessman," Jedediah stammered, backing away. "You're a thief," Victoria said loudly. "And worse." She reached into her pocket and pulled out the leather journal. She held it up for everyone to see. "This is my husband's journal. In his last entry, he wrote that he saw you, Jedediah Cross, inspecting the support beams in the mine 2 days before the collapse. He wrote that you were planning to kill him." "Lies!" Jedediah screamed. He was sweating profusely now. "The rantings of a drunkard, is it?" Victoria challenged. She turned to the crowd. "How many of you have lost your farms to this man? How many of you were squeezed out, foreclosed on, and ruined just when your luck was about to turn?" A low grumble started in the room. A few miners stepped forward. A rancher nodded grimly. The atmosphere in the room shifted. It wasn't a bank transaction anymore. It was a mob waking up. Jedediah saw the tide turning. He saw the hate in their eyes. Panic took over. "I won't listen to this," he shrieked. He reached under his coat. "Don't!" Silas roared. But Jedediah was desperate. He pulled a Derringer pistol from his vest pocket. He didn't aim at Victoria. He aimed at the judge, intending to shoot his way out. Bang! The shot deafened the room. Smoke curled in the air. Judge Holloway sat frozen, untouched. Jedediah Cross stood still, a look of shock on his face. The Derringer dropped from his hand. He looked down at his chest. A crimson stain was spreading across his white silk vest. Victoria stood with the Colt Navy revolver in her hand, the barrel smoking. She hadn't hesitated. She hadn't shaken. She had drawn the heavy weapon her husband had left her and fired a single, perfect shot. Jedediah fell to his knees. He looked at Victoria one last time, his eyes glazing over. "You!" he gurgled. "I told you," Victoria said, her voice devoid of pity. "I am not a helpless widow." Jedediah Cross fell face forward onto the sawdust floor. Dead. The room was deadly silent. Then, a heavy thud. Victoria spun around. Silas had collapsed. The adrenaline that had kept him standing was gone. He lay on the floor, his face ashen, the pool of blood around him growing rapidly. "Silas!" Victoria screamed, dropping the gun and falling to her knees beside him. She grabbed his face. "Silas! Stay with me!" He looked up at her, his eyes losing focus. Did we win? "We won!" she sobbed, pressing her hands to his wound. "We won! Just hold on! Someone get a doctor, now!" The crowd scrambled, but Silas's eyes were closing. The beast of the bighorns had fought his last fight, or so it seemed. The silence in the Golden Steer Saloon was heavy, broken only by the ragged, wet sound of Silas Blackwood's breathing. He was laid out on 2 billiards tables pushed together, his blood pooling on the green felt. Dr. Abernathy, a man with whiskey on his breath but steady hands, dug for the buckshot with silver forceps. Every time he the wound, Silas's unconscious body twitched, an involuntary spasm of agony. Victoria stood at the head of the table, gripping Silas's good hand with such force her knuckles were white. She refused to leave. When the sheriff tried to escort her away to give a statement, she had turned that same cold, deadly gaze on him and said, "If he dies, I have nothing to say to you. If he lives, I'll tell you everything. Now let me be." The town watched. The miners, the ranchers, the barmaids. They watched the woman they had pitied only yesterday now command the room. They watched the beast of the bighorns, a man they had demonized, fighting for his life because he had chosen to save one of their own. "The lead is deep," Dr. Abernathy muttered, dropping a bloody pellet into a metal basin. Clink. "He's lost a lot of blood, Mrs. Miller. A man his size. The heart has to work twice as hard. I've done what I can. The rest is up to him. And God." They moved him at dawn, not to the jail and not back to his mountain. Victoria hired a wagon, padded it with the finest feather ticks from the hotel, and took him home. Back to the Miller Ranch. For 3 weeks, winter refused to let go of the valley. The snow piled high against the farmhouse walls, sealing them in. Inside, a different kind of battle was being waged. Victoria didn't sleep. She barely ate. She spent her days and nights by the bedside, changing bandages, forcing broth between Silas's fever-cracked lips, and washing the sweat from his brow. He raved in his fever. He shouted names from the war. He called out for Thomas. And sometimes, in the darkest part of the night, he called out for her. "Victoria, run. Don't look back." It broke her heart every time. By the 4th week, the fever broke. Victoria was dozing in the rocking chair, a book resting on her lap, when the sound of shifting linens woke her. She snapped awake instantly. Silas was looking at her. His eyes were clear. The hazy, feverish glaze was gone, replaced by that piercing, intelligent blue. He looked weaker, his face gaunt under the beard she had trimmed for him, but he was there. "You're staring," he rasped, his voice sounding like gravel grinding together. Victoria let out a breath she felt she'd been holding for a month. "I'm checking to see if you're a ghost." Silas tried to sit up and winced, his hand going to his bandaged shoulder. "Not yet. Though I feel like I went a few rounds with a grizzly." He looked around the room. He recognized the furniture. The scent of lavender and baking bread. "I'm in your bed," Victoria smiled, a soft, tired smile. "It seemed only fair. You gave me yours when I was freezing." Silas didn't smile back. His expression darkened. He looked at the clean sheets, the sunlight streaming through the lace curtains, and then at Victoria, who looked exhausted but radiant with relief. He swung his legs over the side of the bed. "What are you doing?" Victoria demanded, standing up. "Leaving," Silas grunted. He tried to stand, but his legs were like water. He stumbled, catching himself on the bedpost. "You can barely walk," Victoria cried, rushing to steady him. "Where do you think you're going?" "Back to the mountain," Silas said, refusing to look at her. He pulled his arm away from her grip, though gently. "My job is done, Victoria. Cross is dead." The judge ruled it self-defense. "I heard the sheriff talking to the doc while I was under. You're rich. You own the biggest mine in the territory." "So?" Victoria asked, confused by his coldness. "So?" Silas turned to her, his eyes full of a deep, ancient sadness. You're the Gold Queen of Laramie now. You can have any suitor you want. Doctors from the East. Lawyers. Men who smell like cologne and don't have blood under their fingernails. He gestured to himself, a scarred, rough-hewn mountain man. I'm a wolf, Victoria. You don't keep a wolf in the parlor. It scares the guests. He grabbed his shirt from the chair, his fingers clumsy as he tried to put it on. I did what Thomas asked. I kept you safe. Now I go back to where I belong. Victoria watched him struggle with the buttons. The stubborn, foolish, beautiful man. Stop, she said quietly. He didn't stop. I said stop, Victoria shouted. She crossed the room and ripped the shirt from his hands, throwing it on the floor. Silas froze, staring at her in shock. You listen to me, Silas Blackwood, she said, poking him hard in his good chest. You think this is about a debt? You think you're just some hired gun? I used to get my land back. Ain't I? He challenged, though his voice wavered. Look at me, Victoria. I'm a monster. The whole town knows it. The town knows you're a hero, she countered. But I don't care about the town. I care about the man who held me when I was dying of cold and didn't ask for a thing in return. I care about the man who rode into a shotgun blast to save my life. She took a step closer, invading his space, forcing him to look down at her. You said something to me that night in the cabin, she whispered, her eyes locked on his. Do you remember? Silas swallowed hard. I said a lot of things. You said, to bed with me tonight. Victoria's voice dropped to a hush. You demanded it to save my life. She reached up and placed her hands on his face, her thumbs tracing the rough line of his scars. Now, I'm the one demanding, she said. I don't want a doctor from the East. I don't want a lawyer. I want the man who knows the sound of the wind. I want the beast. Silas stared at her, his defenses crumbling. The ice that had encased his heart since the war, since he retreated to the mountains, shattered completely. I ain't got nothing to give you, Victoria, he whispered hoarsely. Just a cabin and a bad reputation? You have everything I need, she said. She stood on her tiptoes and pressed her lips to his. It wasn't a tentative kiss. It was a claiming. It was fierce and desperate and full of the fire that had kept them both alive through the winter. Silas groaned, a low rumble in his chest, and his good arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her flush against him. He kissed her back with a hunger that had been starving for years. When they finally broke apart, breathless, Silas rested his forehead against hers. You're a dangerous woman, Victoria Miller, he murmured. I learned from the best, she replied. 6 months later, the spring wildflowers were blooming across the valley, turning the pastures into a sea of yellow and purple. The Miller Ranch, now expanded and bustling with hired hands working the new mine entrance, was the jewel of Laramie. On the front porch, a man sat in a rocking chair, whittling a piece of cedar. He wore clean clothes, though he still refused to wear a tie, and his beard was trimmed neat. Victoria walked out of the house, carrying 2 glasses of lemonade. She handed one to Silas and sat on the railing beside him. Sheriff rode by today, Silas said, looking out over the fat cattle grazing in the distance. Oh, what did he want? Wanted to know if I'd consider running for deputy. Said they need someone who can shoot straight, Victoria laughed. What did you tell him? Silas looked up at her, his blue eyes crinkling with a smile that reached all the way to his soul. I told him I was busy. I have a ranch to run and a wife to keep out of trouble. Victoria leaned down and kissed his forehead. You have that backwards, Mr. Blackwood. I'm the one keeping you out of trouble. Silas took her hand, kissing the knuckles. The scars on his shoulder would never fully fade, and the town would always whisper about the day the widow and the beast took down the bank. But as the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in gold and violet, neither of them cared. They had survived the winter. They had survived the wolves. And most importantly, they had found the one thing more valuable than the gold beneath their feet. They had found home. And that is the story of Victoria Miller and Silas Blackwood. It's a reminder that sometimes the monsters we fear are the only ones who can save us, and the respectable men in suits are the true villains. Victoria didn't just survive the storm, she became the storm. She proved that when you back a woman into a corner, you better be ready for the fight of your life. And Silas? He proved that a scarred heart often beats the strongest. I want to know what you would have done. If you were Victoria, Standing in that saloon with the gun in your hand, would you have pulled the trigger? Or would you have let the law handle it? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this story of revenge, romance, and justice, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And if you haven't already, smash that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a story. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.